On the morning of April 18th, 1983, the water reached the porch before Nadine Renfro finished her second cup of coffee. It wasn't rainwater. There had been rain 4 days of it the week before, but that had come and gone, and the ditches had taken it the way ditches do. It wasn't spring runoff either. The creek along the east line was running low enough that morning that you could see the gravel bar under the county bridge. This was something else. It came across the field, slow and flat, and without a sound the way water moves when nothing is pushing it from behind a sheet an inch deep. And then two, carrying broken cattail stalks and a length of somebody's fence wire, and the quiet confidence of men who believed they had finally found a way to move a widow off her ground without ever having to say so out loud. Nadine stood on the top step in a pair of work boots that had belonged to her husband, size 10 and a half, and she wore two pairs of socks to make them fit. And she had been wearing them since the second week of November 1981, because they were better boots than any she had ever owned, and because a woman who has just buried a man at 41 years old does not have money for boots. She watched the water take another 20 feet of winter wheat. She had drilled that wheat herself the previous October alone, on ground she had dissed alone, and it had come through the winter better than she had any right to expect. On the 15th of April, it had been the one thing on that whole 83 acres she was proud of. She did not say anything. She did not go get the camera, not yet. She stood there with a cup in her hand and watched it, and behind her in the machine shed, on the rise a 1956 John Deere 420 utility tractor sat under a canvas tarp, with dried mud still packed up under the fenders from the fall before. Most people who drove past that place in the next few weeks saw a drowned farm. Nadine Renfro saw water behaving exactly the way water has always behaved, which is to say, going where somebody had made it go. Let me tell you about her because she is not the woman these stories usually have in them. She was 39 years old that spring, not 70, not a grandmother on a porch swing with a lifetime of wisdom already banked. 39 with a 14-year-old daughter and a mortgage-free farm she could not afford to operate, and hands with white scars across the backs of them from baling wire and hedge thorns, in one long one from a hydraulic line that let go in 1977. She had grown up 11 miles north in Pemiscot County, the daughter of a man who ran a drag line for the drainage district for 29 years. That matters, and it is going to matter more later, so hold on to it. Her father spent 3 decades digging ditches through the Missouri boot heel and coming home at night with gumbo clay dried to his forearms like plaster. And she was the kid who asked him questions about it at supper, and he was the kind of man who answered. She married Delmar Renfro in 1966. They rented for 2 years. In May of 1968, they bought 83 acres of bottomland in the south end of Dunklin County for $46,800, borrowing nearly every dollar of it from a production credit association in Kennett, and it took them 15 years of soybeans winter wheat secondhand equipment and doing without to own it free and clear. Delmar never got to enjoy that. The last payment cleared in the spring of 1981. He died in October, third week of the month in the middle of soybean harvest. He shut the little John Deere off at the end of a round, stepped down, off it, started walking across the stubble toward the combine, and did not get there. 41 years old. The county ambulance out of Kennett took 31 minutes to reach that field, and there was nothing in it that would have helped if it had taken 4. Some of the neighbors brought casseroles. Some of them brought offers on the ground. A few brought both in the same week in the same truck. She kept the farm. Everybody said she'd sell by spring. She put a crop in instead and then another one. And by the spring of 1983, she was 18 months into running 83 acres with a 14-year-old and a tractor older than her marriage. And she was, if you had asked anybody in Hornersville, about 6 weeks from being done. They were not wrong about the arithmetic. They were wrong about her. She never hurried her words. She rarely looked away when somebody challenged her. People took the quiet for uncertainty the way people always do, and they found out otherwise, and they generally found out at the worst possible time for them. Now, before this goes any further, you need to understand the ground itself, because everything that happens in this story, the flood, the courthouse, the lawsuit, all of it happens because of what is under that field, and almost nobody involved knew what was under that field. The Missouri boot heel is the flattest farmland in America. You can stand on a turn row in Dunklin County and see 4 miles in every direction and not find 18 inches of relief anywhere in it. It is also, and this is the part people forget, a floodplain of the Mississippi River. The whole thing, every acre. The river built that ground over 10,000 years by wandering back and forth across it like a garden hose left running in a yard, and it did not lay that ground down evenly. The topsoil in that part of the county is sharky clay. Heavy is not a strong enough word for it. Sharky clay is the kind of soil that when it's wet you cannot walk on it without carrying half of it away on your boots, and when it's dry it cracks open in fissures you can lose a wrench in. It holds water like a plastic bag. That is its whole personality. Here is how Nadine could tell you what she was standing on without any instrument at all. And if you grew up around bottom ground, you already know this one. You take a pinch of moist soil out of the top 4 inches. You work it between your thumb and the side of your forefinger, and you push it out into a ribbon, and you keep pushing until the ribbon breaks under its own weight. Sand won't ribbon at all. It falls apart and it feels gritty against your thumb, and there's nothing to it. Silt makes a short ribbon maybe an inch, and it feels smooth and floury, almost like talc. Clay ribbons 2 inches, 3, sometimes more, and it comes out shiny where your thumb dragged across it, and it feels slick, and it feels like it has an opinion about being handled. Sharky clay ribbons for days. Nadine could hand you a pinch of it, and you'd think you were holding modeling compound. That soil is why the boot heel got drained and levied and ditched in landform for 80 years. And it's why the people who farm it think about water more than any other farmers in this country. Because water does not soak into sharky clay. It stands on it. And if it stands on it in April, you don't plant. And if you don't plant, you don't eat. Delmar's father landformed that 83 acres in 1963, back when the government would pay you by the acre to smooth ground flat enough to irrigate. He filled a shallow, crooked depression that ran diagonally across the southwest quarter of the field, hauling dirt into it for the better part of 2 seasons. He also gave up on a piece of low ground beyond the fence, in 1961, a boggy 200 yards of willow and buckbrush. The family had always called the slough because it would not dry out no matter what you did to it, and no crop he ever put in it made a bushel worth cutting. Both of those things, the depression he filled and the slough he quit, are going to matter enormously. Neither of them meant a thing to anybody in the spring of 1983. Tanya Renfro was 14, 8th grade at Hornersville. She had her father's chin and her mother's habit of going quiet instead of loud. And that spring, she came home 4 days out of 5 and went straight to her room. There is a specific cruelty that 14-year-olds are capable of, and it is not usually the mean kind. It is the offhand kind. A boy in her algebra class asked her twice in 1 week whether her mama had learned to swim yet. Somebody drew a picture of a house with a fish in the window and left it in her locker. A girl she had been friends with since the 3rd grade started sitting somewhere else at lunch, not out of cruelty at all, just because sitting next to the Renfro girl had gotten complicated and there was an easier table. Tanya never told her mother about any of it. Nadine found out in June from a teacher in a grocery store aisle, and by then it had been going on for 8 weeks. That's the thing about that spring. Everybody in that house was protecting somebody else from something, and it was costing all of them. The trouble came from 3 miles upstream, which in country that flat means 3 miles northeast, which is a direction, not a slope. A company called Ashmore Aggregates had leased something like 400 acres in the summer of 1982 for a sand and gravel operation. Not a huge outfit by the standards of the industry, but a big one for Dunklin County, 42 trucks, a wash plant, a scale house, 60-some employees, and a payroll that got spent at the parts store and the cafe and the tire shop in Kennett. In a county that had lost 19% of its population since 1960, a company that hires 60 people is not a company. It's a civic institution. They dug below the water table, which is what you do when you're mining alluvial sand, and the pit filled, and that was fine and expected and permitted. What they did in the fall of 1982 was build a berm. An earthen embankment, roughly 1,100 feet long along the west side of the operation. The stated purpose in the permit file was surface water management, keeping storm runoff from sheeting into the pit and drowning $1 million worth of plant and conveyor. Nobody in the county thought twice about it. Farmers build berms. Everybody builds berms. Then it rained in November and the southwest corner of the Renfro place stood in water for 11 days. Then it rained in February and it stood again. Then in March, on ground that had been dry for 2 weeks with no rain in the forecast, Nadine walked out one morning and found 40 yards of her turn row soft enough that she sank to her ankle in it. She called the county. A man came out in the second week of March, walked the property line, wrote 3 lines in a notebook and said it looked like ordinary bottomland seepage and that everything upstream appeared to be permitted and in compliance. Paperwork moves slow, water moves fast. That's not a slogan, that's just the schedule. By the second week of April, standing water covered nearly 20 acres of the Renfro place. By the third week, 40, and on April 18th, it came over the porch. Now let me tell you about the one man in that county who was completely calm about all of it. Thurman Vandiver was 72 years old, and he farmed the 160 acres adjoining Nadine's on the north, which his father had bought in 1937, with borrowed money in the worst decade this country ever had. He was born in 1911. He was old enough to remember the flood of 1927 as a boy of 16 and old enough to have helped clear brush and dead timber out of the bottoms after the flood of 1945 as a man of 34. His back had a bend in it. His hand still closed around a 3/4 wrench with a grip that surprised people who underestimated him, which was most people who met him after about 1975. His wife died in 1978, and he had not, in the 5 years since, gotten out of the habit of making coffee for two. He drove a 1949 Farmall M. His father bought it new for $1,975 at a dealership in Caruthersville, 38 horsepower on the drawbar. And Thurman had rebuilt the engine twice with his own hands and replaced every bearing in it at least once and changed the oil every 100 operating hours since Truman was president. It did not sound like a machine. It sounded like a memory of a machine, which is a different thing, and anybody who has stood in a farmyard at 6 in the morning and heard one start knows exactly what I mean. He came down the field road on the morning of the 18th, about an hour after the water reached the porch. He did not offer to help because there was nothing to help with. He stood at the flooded fence beside her and looked at it for a while. He said, "They're hoping you'll go." Nadine said, "I know. They're figuring you can't stand another season." "I know that too." Thurman looked out across the water at the drowned wheat for the better part of a minute. Then he said something that she thought about for the next 9 weeks. "They forgot what this ground used to be." And Nadine said, "So have we." Neither one of them explained what they meant. They didn't have to. And the truth is, on the 18th of April, neither one of them could have explained it because the thing they were both circling was buried under 6 feet of sharky clay and 35 years of forgetting. But here's what Nadine did next, and this is the first thing in this story that a lot of people got wrong afterward when they told it. She did not go to a lawyer. She did not go to the newspaper. She went and got a pair of binoculars and she started watching the weather. Her father's binoculars from a shelf in the closet, a heavy pair of Bushnells with the leather gone brittle on the strap. He'd use them for looking at ditch banks a mile off without walking a mile. Here was her thinking, and it was not complicated. Water that comes from rain arrives when it rains. Water that comes from somebody's decision arrives when somebody decides. So she watched the sky, and when the radio out of Blytheville said a line was coming, she got in the truck. There is a county road that runs north and east up past the Ashmore property, and from a bridge approach on that road at a certain angle, you can see the west end of their impoundment from about 600 yards. That's public road. Anybody can sit on it. She sat on it 3 times. The first was April 20th ahead of a storm that came through at 9 at night. She parked at 7:30 with the engine off, and she glassed the west end of that berm in the last of the light, and she saw what she went there to see. There was a structure in it, not the berm itself. Set into it near the low end, a concrete box maybe 5 feet across with a vertical steel plate in a frame and a hand wheel on a threaded stem coming up out of it. A slide gate. The plainest, oldest, most reliable piece of water control equipment ever built. You turn the wheel, the plate goes up, water goes through. You turn it the other way, the plate goes down, and it doesn't. At 7:40 on the evening of April 20th, that gate was closed. She watched a man in a yellow hard hat walk out to it on the crest of the berm, put a bar on the wheel, check something, and walk back. It rained 2¼ inches that night. She went back at daylight on the 21st. The gate was open and there was a column of muddy water coming out of it into the county ditch on the far side, and the pond behind the berm was 3 feet lower than it had been the night before. She wrote all of that in a spiral notebook with the date and the time. The second was April 22nd ahead of a smaller storm. Same thing. Gate closed at dusk. Gate opened the next morning. The third was April 26th, and this time she took Tanya with her and had her write the times down while Nadine held the glasses because two people writing the same thing at the same time in two different hands is worth more later than one person's word. And she'd learned that from her father, who had testified in 3 drainage district disputes in his life and had opinions about record keeping. Gate closed at 6:15 p.m. on the 26th. Gate opened at 7:10 a.m. on the 27th. And Nadine Renfro sat in her truck on a county road with a notebook on her knee and understood something that changed the shape of everything that came after. This wasn't a design flaw. This wasn't a berm that had been built a little too high by a contractor who didn't know any better. Somebody was standing out there in the rain with a bar in his hands turning a wheel. It was a decision, it had a schedule, it had a man assigned to it. And whatever was happening to her fields was not weather. It was operations. Now she did not yet know why. Understand that. She had proof of a pattern and no theory at all about the mechanism. Because here is the thing that made no sense: that gate discharged into a county ditch that ran north, away from her. Every gallon they let out went the other direction. So how in the world did closing a gate 3 miles northeast put 4 inches of standing water on the southwest corner of her farm? The answer to that question was in the courthouse basement in Kennett, and she found it on the third night. She had gone to Thurman's kitchen on the 23rd and laid the whole thing out the gate, the times, the notebook, and asked him one question. She asked him whether anybody had ever mapped that ground before it was farmed. Thurman Vandiver poured her a cup of coffee. He thought about it for a good while. And then he said one sentence, and it was the only substantive thing he contributed to this entire case, and he never claimed otherwise for the rest of his life. He said, "Try the 48 box." She asked him what that meant. He said that after the flood of 1945, the county had run a drainage survey. Not the state, not the Corps, the county with its own crews on foot, and his father had walked part of it with them as a landowner witness. He said he'd been 37 years old and hadn't paid it any mind. He said he thought it got finished around 1948, and he thought they made a map, and he said he had no idea whether the county still had it or where it would be, and that was the end of what he knew. That's it. That's the whole of the advice. One sentence, no map, no theory, and an old man's honest admission that he didn't know if the thing even existed. Nadine Renfro did the rest of it herself. The Dunklin County Courthouse in Kennett has a basement, and in 1983 the basement had a records room, and the records room had a woman named Verla in charge of it who worked 8 to 4:30 and did not care for people who came in at 4:15. Nadine came in at 8. The first night she got permission to stay till 6 and found nothing but tax plats and school district boundary changes. The second night she found a run of drainage district minute books from 1927 through 1961 and read the 1948 volume front to back and found a resolution authorizing payment of $1,140 to a survey crew for reconnaissance of overflow drainage South Townships, and no map attached. The third night, Tuesday the 26th of April, the same day she'd sat on the bridge with Tanya in the binoculars, she found a wooden map case shoved behind a shelf of abstract books. 4 drawers warped, the bottom drawer swollen shut. She got it open with a screwdriver she went out to the truck for. Inside, rolled and tied with cotton string that came apart in her fingers, were 11 linen-backed sheets. The one she wanted was the 4th one down. It was drawn in ink on linen, hand-lettered 39 inches by 26, and the title block in the lower right corner read Drainage Reconnaissance, South Townships, Dunklin County, Missouri. And under that the date, August 12, 1948. Nadine Renfro carried it up out of that basement and laid it out on a table under a window and looked at it for 20 minutes without moving, and what she was looking at was this. The 1948 crew had not mapped the surface, or rather, they had mapped the surface, but they had mapped it the way a man walks it, not the way a camera sees it. They had noted where the timber grew different. They had noted where crawfish chimneys clustered thick. They had noted where standing water sat 3 days longer than the ground beside it. They had noted the places old-timers in 1948 told them the water always came up first, and they had drawn in blue a line. It came in from the northeast, wandered southwest across 4 sections in a lazy S, and it was labeled in a careful draftsman's hand, Old Overflow Channel Miss. R abandoned. It ran directly under what was 34 years later the Ashmore Aggregates Western Berm. It ran directly under the southwest corner of the Renfro farm. And it ran directly into the 200 yards of low ground that Delmar's father had given up on in 1961, and everybody in that family had called the slough for 20 years without ever once wondering why it was there. She rolled it up. She drove home at 11 at night. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with a cup of coffee she never drank, and she thought about a thing her husband said to her one time in a wet spring, standing at the end of a turn row looking at water where there shouldn't have been water. He'd said it offhand. He said a lot of things offhand. He said water don't forget where it used to live. She had said something like, and gone on into the house because she was carrying groceries. And it was a Tuesday and it was 1977, and there was nothing in the world about that sentence that seemed like it was going to matter. She sat in her kitchen at 2 in the morning on the 27th of April, 1983, with a linen map from 1948 rolled up on the chair beside her, and she heard him say it again as clear as if he was standing at the sink. 2 days later, she found out what he'd meant. But before that, there was a meeting. The Dunklin County Commission called a public session for Thursday afternoon, April 28th, in the second-floor courtroom of the courthouse in Kennett to hear concerns regarding drainage in the South Townships. There were about 90 people in that room: landowners, 2 bank officers, an insurance adjuster from Sykeston, a reporter from the Daily Dunklin Democrat, the county engineer, and a table down front for Ashmore Aggregates. The man who spoke for the company was named Kent Stanton, 34 years old, engineering degree out of roller class of 71. He had spent the first 10 years of his career running grade for a highway contractor out of Cape Girardeau, which is honest work and hard work, and had given him a set of instincts about dirt that were mostly right and one blind spot that was going to matter more than everything else he knew. He'd been project manager at the Ashmore Pit for a little under a year. He had a new pickup and a watch that cost more than Nadine's disc, and the specific confidence of a man who had learned his profession from documents rather than seasons. He was not a bad man. I want that on the table early because this story does not work if you think he was. He presented for 22 minutes. Drainage maps, elevation surveys, 30-year rainfall averages for the Kennett Station, a summary of the permit conditions on the Western impoundment, and a note that a state inspection in January had found no violations. Then he addressed the complaints directly, and he did it politely, and he did it the way you do when you are certain. He said the company was aware that some landowners to the southwest had experienced standing water. He said the company sympathized. He said that the geotechnical work done prior to permitting had characterized the subsurface across the western portion of the site as clay to a depth in excess of 40 feet, and that there was, therefore, no pathway by which the impoundment could be communicating with groundwater on adjacent property. He said, and this is close to verbatim because the Democrat ran it, the material under that berm is sharky clay. It is one of the least permeable soils in North America. Whatever is happening downstream, it is not coming through 40 feet of clay, which was based on the document in his hand 100% correct. And then he looked toward the third row where a woman in a denim jacket was sitting by herself, and he said the sentence that put this whole story on the map. He said, "We've heard concerns from Mrs. Renfro in particular, and I'd say this respectfully farming flood-prone bottom ground has always carried a risk. It carried it before we got here, and it'll carry it after. Given the situation, it may be worth considering whether this is the right time to sell." Several people nodded, and then somebody laughed. It came from the left side of the room, and it was not, in fairness, a cruel laugh at the start. It was the laugh of a man who has been sitting on a hard bench for 50 minutes and has just heard somebody say the obvious out loud. But another one joined it, and another. And within about 4 seconds, the second-floor courtroom of the Dunklin County Courthouse was full of the specific sound of 40 men laughing at one woman, which is a sound that does not need to be cruel to do the work of cruelty. Kent Stanton did not stop it. He didn't encourage it either. He just folded his arms and let it run, and that is the thing he was still thinking about 11 years later. Nadine Renfro stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles out of the front of her denim jacket, which took about 2 seconds and which had the effect of making everybody wait. She looked at Kent Stanton, and she said so quietly that the back half of the room leaned forward to hear it. If you're finished laughing, you might want to find out where your water's actually going. The room went down about halfway. Then she picked up a cardboard tube off the bench beside her, walked down the center aisle, unrolled 39 inches of linen-back county survey across the table in front of the commissioners, and put a salt shaker from the water pitcher tray on one corner to hold it flat. And the room went the rest of the way down. Not because anybody believed her, because a brittle hand-drawn map from 1948 landing on a table in the middle of a modern permitting fight is the single most physically interesting thing that had happened in that building in 10 years. The presiding commissioner leaned over it. The county engineer got up out of his chair and came around. Kent Stanton looked at it for maybe 15 seconds and said, "Mrs. Renfro, I don't see what a survey that old changes." And Nadine put her finger on the blue line at the northeast end and started walking it southwest. She walked it under the Ashmore property. She kept walking it. She walked it under her own farm and off the bottom edge of the sheet. And then she looked up and she said, "It changes what's under your berm." Now, let me stop the story here and explain what she was actually claiming. Because if you don't understand this, the next hour of this doesn't land. And if you do understand it, everything that happens after is inevitable. Rivers wander. Over thousands of years, the Mississippi swung back and forth across the boot heel, and every time it moved, it left its old bed behind. Those old beds got buried by the next flood's silt and the next ones after that. So here is what's under a boot heel field. On top, the heavy sharky clay, the stuff the river dropped out of slow-standing floodwater, fine as face powder, tight as a drum. Under that in some places, and not others, the old channel's bands of clean, coarse, well-sorted sand, because sand is what a moving river drops in its own bed. Now think of that sand band as a pipe running under the ground. It isn't a hollow pipe, it's solid sand. But water moves through loose sand almost the way it moves through a pipe because sand is nothing but millions of tiny connected gaps and water finds every one of them. And on top of that pipe is a lid, 40 feet of sharky clay in places which holds water about as well as a truck tire. Farmers who work old floodplain ground have a way of describing that sand, and I've heard the same one from 3 states. It's like somebody buried a bundle of 1,000,000 drinking straws under your field. Now here's the part that changes everything. Raise the water level at one end of that buried sand, say by damming and ponding storm runoff behind an earthen berm sitting right on top of it, and the water in the sand does not just sit there. It goes under pressure, real pressure, measurable pressure, and it pushes out in every direction looking for the weakest place in the lid. If it finds one 3 miles away, it comes up there. Not over the surface, not down a ditch, up. Through the floor of somebody's field days after the rain quit, in a spot where the ground is a little lower and the clay is a little thinner. And nobody has thought about it since 1961. That's called a confined aquifer under artesian head. And if you have ever seen a flowing well, a pipe stuck in the ground with water coming out the top of it, and no pump on it anywhere, you have seen exactly this, and nobody had to explain it to you. It is also, and this is the whole tragedy of that April, completely invisible from the surface. There is no ditch to follow. There is no wet trail leading back to the culprit. There is a dry summer and a berm going up, and then months later water rising in a field that has no explanation for it. Which is why the men who know it best are almost never engineers. They're the men who have farmed one specific piece of bottom ground for 40 years and know that the southwest corner comes up first every single time and cannot tell you why and don't need to. Nadine Renfro could not have used the words confined aquifer that afternoon. What she said instead, standing at that table, was this: "That old channel isn't a ditch. It's sand. It's a sand bed a couple 100 yards wide, running under both our places at about 6 foot. Water gets in it up on your end, and it's got no place to go but out the low end, and the low end is my farm. You didn't put water on my ground across the top. You put it under it." The county engineer said quietly that it was an interesting theory. Kent Stanton said, and he said it without any heat at all, "Our geotechnical report shows clay to 40 feet under that berm. I've read it. There's no sand in it." And Nadine Renfro said, "Then somebody drilled the wrong hole." She had no idea. She said it the way you say a thing when you're out of arguments and you're going to say the strongest sentence you've got and let it sit. She was more right than anybody in that room, including her, understood at the time. The meeting ended without a resolution. The commission said it would take the matter under advisement and review the permit file. The Democrat ran 4 paragraphs on page 3 under the headline, "County Hears Drainage Complaints." The reporter got Nadine's name right and the date of the survey wrong. People filed out. A few of them said something kind to her on the way past in low voices, the way men do when they don't want to be seen saying it. An insurance adjuster from Sykeston named Corinne Shipp stopped at the table and looked at the 1948 map for a full minute without saying anything, and then asked Nadine if she could get a photocopy of it, and Nadine said yes. That's all that happened at that meeting. Except for one thing, and it happened in the last 2 minutes, and Nadine almost missed it. She was rolling the map up when she heard 2 men behind her talking about the Kelso place 3 farms east, which had gone under the same as hers. And one of them said, not quietly enough, that he'd heard the Kelsos had already got their price and were just waiting on the option to run. Nadine did not turn around. She finished rolling the map. She put the string on it. And the next morning, Friday the 29th of April, 1983 at 8 o'clock, she walked into the Dunklin County Recorder of Deeds office and asked to see the option contracts filed against property in Township 17 North Range, 9 East for the last 2 years. Now, a lot of people don't know this, and it's the reason she was able to do what she did next. Land option contracts get recorded. They have to be if the buyer wants any protection at all, because an unrecorded option is worth nothing against a third party. And recorded means public. Anybody can walk in off the street and read them. You don't need a lawyer, you don't need a reason, you don't need to explain yourself to anybody. You just need to know they exist and be willing to spend a morning. Nadine spent a morning. She found 3. The first was against the Kelso place, 460 acres, dated November 1982. Option to purchase 18-month term strike price, $140 an acre. The second was against the Duckworth Farm on the West Line, 220 acres, dated January 1983. Same structure, $135 an acre. The third was against 80 acres the Lambert family owned along the West Ditch, dated March 1983, 6 weeks earlier. $122 an acre. Buyer on all 3, Ashmore Aggregates Inc., and when she got to the signature page on the third one, down at the bottom under the notary block was a line she had not expected to be there at all. Broker of record. And on that line in a hand she had watched sign her own loan documents in February in blue ballpoint Lowell Prentice. Nadine Renfro sat down in a wooden chair in the recorder's office in Kennett, Missouri, and she did the arithmetic, and it went like this. 3 farms, all in a line, all southwest of the pit. All of them, without exception, sitting on top of the blue line on a linen map from August of 1948. And every one of those prices was 30 to 40% below what dry crop land in that township was bringing that year. She had been thinking for 6 weeks that a company wanted her off her farm. Sitting in that chair, she understood that no company on earth wanted her 83 acres. Her 83 acres were unremarkable. What they wanted was a corridor, 4 properties in a row along a 200-yard wide ribbon of the cleanest, coarsest, most valuable construction sand in the south end of Dunklin County. Sand that was worth in place more than the ground on top of it would earn in 100 years of soybeans. They didn't want the farms. They wanted what was under the farms. And the fastest, cheapest, most completely legal way to buy 4 flooded farms at flood prices is to make sure they're flooded. She sat there a long time. Then she walked out onto the courthouse square and got in her truck and drove home. And she got there a little before noon, and at 20 after 12, the mail carrier's truck came up the lane. He had something for her that needed a signature. The letter came on a Friday, and it came certified, which in Dunklin County meant somebody wanted a signature a good deal more than they wanted a conversation. Nadine signed for it, standing in 6 inches of standing water at the end of the lane, with the truck idling behind her and the smell of wet bottom ground coming off that field like something breathing. She didn't open it there. She carried it up to the house, set it on the kitchen table next to the sugar bowl, and poured herself coffee she did not want. Then she opened it. Farmers Trust of Kennett across the top. Below that, 4 paragraphs of language built by lawyers to sound like weather impersonal inevitable. Nobody's fault, no verbs with people attached to them. The operating note. $19,400 executed the previous February against the 1983 crop. And then the sentence that mattered buried in the third paragraph, the way a hook is buried in a worm. Due to material adverse change in the borrower's collateral position, the bank hereby accelerates the above-referenced note. Payment in full is required on or before July 1st, 1983. She read it twice. Then she looked out the window at 40 acres of water, where 40 acres of soybean ground was supposed to be, and she understood exactly what had happened. The bank had not called her note because she'd missed a payment. She hadn't missed one. The bank had called her note because the water made it legal to. Let me explain how this worked in 1983, because a lot of people don't know it, and it is the quiet engine under half the farm stories out of that decade. An operating note is not a mortgage. It's the money you borrow in February to buy seed and fuel and chemical, and you pay it back in November out of what you cut. It is secured by the crop by a plant that does not exist yet growing in a field 60 days from now. That's the deal. That's always been the deal. It's a promise written against a season. Now, when the crop is underwater, the collateral is gone. And when the collateral is gone, essentially every operating note written in this country carries a clause that lets the lender declare the whole balance due immediately. Which means a woman can do everything right, pay every note early for 15 years, never once ask for an extension, never miss a payment in her life, and still have the entire thing come due in a single spring. Not because she failed at anything, because water arrived. But there was a second signature on that note, and it's the one that actually mattered. Farmers Trust had not written $19,400 against a crop alone. In February, 3 months after she buried her husband with no operating history in her own name, no credit file that was hers, in a farm she had run for exactly one season, the bank had asked Nadine Renfro for a deed of trust on the land as additional security. She signed it at that counter on a Tuesday morning because there was no other way on God's earth to put a crop in the ground that spring. Delmar Renfro paid that farm off across 15 years. His widow pledged it back in 90 minutes. And the deed of trust she signed had an impairment clause in it, which meant the bank did not have to wait for her to default on anything at all. It only had to decide in its own judgment that the security behind the note wasn't worth what it had been. The water had already decided that for them. Down in the corner of the letter, initialed in blue ballpoint beside the loan officer's typed name, were 2 letters she had seen on 100 documents. LP, the same Lowell Prentice whose name she had read 4 hours earlier on the broker's line of 3-option contracts in the recorder's office. Nadine looked at that letter for a long while. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with the seed receipts because she had 83 acres to walk and a daughter coming home on a bus in 4 hours. And neither of those things cared what a bank had decided. Here is what she did not do. She did not cry. She did not call anybody. She did not drive to town to argue with a man in a lobby. She got the notebook. She wrote 2 dates at the top of a clean page. June 15th. Final plant date under her crop insurance policy. Miss it and there is no 1983 soybean crop. Not a late one, not a poor one. None. The policy simply stops covering the ground on the 16th. July 1st. $19,400. Then she drew a line down the middle of the page and started listing what she actually had. Have you ever had to write your whole life on one sheet of paper and find out how short the list is? That's a hard morning. Nadine Renfro had it on the 29th of April, 1983. There's one more person on that farm that spring who does not get enough of this story, and I want to put her in now before she matters, so you know who she is when she does. Corinne Shipp adjusted the crop loss for the insurance carrier out of Sykeston. She was in her early 50s, drove a Buick with 190,000 miles on it, and had been adjusting farm claims in southeast Missouri since 1961. She came out to the Renfro place 3 times in April and twice in May. She photographed 60 acres of standing water from 11 different angles. She measured, she staked, she wrote. And on the cause of loss line of her field report, the line that determines whether a claim gets paid and by whom and against whom, she wrote that, in her professional opinion, the proximate cause of loss on that farm was not precipitation. Her company asked her twice to soften that sentence. She left it in both times. Remember the name. She's going to matter in July. Ashmore Aggregates did not respond to the April 28th meeting for 12 days. And when they did not send Kent Stanton. They sent a resume. Dr. Adele Kroll arrived in a rented Cutlass with Illinois plates in a briefcase that had never once sat on the floor of a truck. She was 44 years old, a consulting hydrologist out of Carbondale with a doctorate and 11 publications, and the 20 minutes she spent in front of the Dunklin County Commission in special session on the 10th of May were the most professionally handled 20 minutes anybody in that room had ever witnessed. She was not rude. That was the thing about her. She never raised her voice. She never once said the widow's name in a tone anybody could have complained about afterward. She simply took the 1948 survey apart. The document, she explained, was a hand-run drainage reconnaissance prepared in August of 1948 by county crews using chain rod and level in the aftermath of the 1945 high water. It was, she said, an admirable piece of work for its era, and she meant it. It was also, she said, superseded. Then she held up a second map. Soil Conservation Service, 1971. Aerial photogrammetry. Contour intervals at 1 foot. Cross-reference to the channel improvement work the Corps finished on the ditch system through the 60s. The 1971 survey shows no relic channel feature beneath the western berm, she said. None. The 1948 document shows a linear depression, which the 1948 crews interpreted as an abandoned overflow channel. 23 years later, with instruments those men could only have dreamed about, nobody could find it. One of the commissioners asked the obvious question. Could the old map be right and the new one wrong? Dr. Kroll allowed that anything was possible. Then she said the line that ran above the fold in the Democrat the next morning. In hydrology, we don't build policy on the most dramatic map. We build it on the most recent one. It was a good line. It was also almost exactly backwards, and there were maybe 4 people in that county capable of explaining why, and none of them were in that room. Let me tell you what Dr. Adele Kroll actually did there. Because it was not a lie. It was something subtler, and it's worth understanding, and it happens in courtrooms and county commissions every week of the year. A 1948 crew walking a field with a rod and a chain was measuring the ground. They walked the low spots on foot. They noted where the willow grew and the cottonwood didn't. They noted where the crawfish chimneys stood thick. They noted where water sat 3 days longer than the ground 20 feet away. They talked to men who had farmed that section since 1910 and wrote down what those men told them. They were measuring in the most literal sense available to them the memory of the land. A 1971 aerial survey was measuring the surface. After 23 years of land-forming ditch cutting and heavy equipment leveling every field in the Boot Heel Flat enough to irrigate. Of course, the depression was gone by 1971. Farmers had filled it. The government had paid them by the acre to fill it. Delmar Renfro's own father filled the piece that crossed his farm in 1963 with 2 seasons of hauled dirt in a borrowed pan. The channel had not disappeared. The evidence on top of it had. But that is a thing you have to say slowly to people who are willing to listen slowly. And the commission had a 40-minute agenda item in a hot room and a consultant with a doctorate. Nadine sat in the 3rd row and said nothing at all. Thurman Vandiver sat beside her with his hat on his knee, 72 years old, and he said nothing either because she had asked him not to. That was her decision, and she'd made it in his kitchen 2 nights before. They'll eat you alive in there, he told her. Probably. I could speak. My daddy walked that survey. You could. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn on the oilcloth. And then it's an old man's story about his daddy. They'll pat you on the shoulder and thank you for coming and vote however Ashmore needs them to. He looked at her a while. And if you speak, then it's a landowner making a claim about her own ground, Nadine said, which they have to answer in writing. The old man smiled into his coffee, and he did not argue. And he never once for the rest of that spring tried to take a meeting away from her again. The town turned in the 2nd week of May, and it turned at the grain elevator, which is where things in a farm town almost always turn. Hoyt Tillery ran the elevator at Hornersville. Scale house, 2 concrete legs, a Quonset full of seed and chemical, and 40 years of ledger books in which just about every family in the south end of the county had been carried through one bad year or another. Hoyt had carried Delmar Renfro through 1974 when the beans made 12 bushel and the price went in the tank. He had carried Thurman Vandiver twice. He was not a hard man, and nobody who knew him would have called him one. Nadine came in on the 11th of May and asked to charge seed beans and a drum of chemical against fall delivery the same as she had every spring since she was 24 years old. Hoyt Tillery looked at the counter for a long moment before he answered. I can't do it, Nadine. She didn't say anything. Your notes accelerated. I called over to check. That's just what I do. You know that. If the bank forecloses in July, there's no fall delivery because there's no crop and there's no farm. I'd be putting $3,000 of seed on ground that's already spoken for. That's true, she said. And I'd be doing it with money that isn't mine. 14 other accounts on that same book. That's true too. He wanted her to fight him. You could see it on him. A man can absorb being yelled at a whole lot easier than he can absorb being agreed with. Nadine picked up her purse. Hoyt, she said at the door, when you called over there, who'd you talk to? He didn't answer. Was it Lowell? Hoyt Tillery looked out the window at the scale. He called me, he said quietly. I didn't call him. She nodded, once walked out to the parking lot and sat in her truck for maybe 30 seconds before she started it. That was the only time all spring that anybody in that county saw Nadine Renfro sit still in a vehicle without a reason. Word moves the way it moves. By the 15th, the county had sorted itself into 2 rooms without anybody announcing that a sorting was underway. The men who ate breakfast at the Hornersville Cafe at 6 were mostly on her side, because most of them had farmed bottom ground long enough to know that water does not go where the map says. It goes where it has always gone, and it does not care one bit whose name is on the deed. The men who ate lunch at the country club in Kennett at noon were mostly not because Ashmore Aggregates had 42 trucks and a payroll and had just agreed to rock 2 miles of county road at cost, and because a widow with a flooded farm was in the arithmetic of a shrinking county, a small number. Both rooms thought they were being reasonable. That's the part people forget about a town turning on somebody. From the inside, it almost never feels like cruelty. It feels like arithmetic. Now, in a few minutes, you are going to watch a 39-year-old widow drive a hand-built steel probe into her own flooded field and pull up something out of that ground that had no business being there, and then hand it to the man who stood in a courthouse and told 90 people she ought to sell. But before that happens, you need to understand what she was actually looking for and how she went about it, because it is the entire case, and it cost about $11. Nadine Renfro built the probe herself in the machine shed on the 16th of May. Half-inch galvanized conduit, 3 10-foot sticks, threaded couplings, a garden hose fitting brazed onto the top, and the bottom end crimped and cross-drilled. Delmar's welder. His hood, his gloves, his rod out of a can with a lid rusted onto it. She had not struck an arc since the fall of 1981. The first 2 beads were ugly and she ground them off, and the third one was fine. She pulled it with the little John Deere and 100 feet of garden hose off the hydrant at the shed. Here is how a jetting probe works, and it is the cheapest piece of subsurface science ever invented by anybody. You run water down the inside of the pipe under pressure. The water washes soil out from under the tip and carries it back up the outside of the pipe, and the pipe sinks under its own weight. You are not drilling. You are letting water dig the hole and then following it down. And the thing that makes it worth anything at all is this: you can feel what you are in. Heavy clay resists. It grips the pipe. The return water comes up gray-brown and slick as paint, and you have to work the pipe up and down and lean on it to make an inch. Sand releases. The pipe drops. It just goes sometimes a foot at a time, sometimes 2, and the return water comes up cloudy and gritty, and if you catch a bucket of it and let it stand 10 minutes, it lays down a layer on the bottom with a texture you can grind between your finger and your thumb. She ran 11 holes between the 16th of May and the 19th. She logged every one of them: depth to change, color of the return, feel, date and time of day. She marked their positions on a plat she'd traced by hand off the 1948 survey at the kitchen table with a pencil and a straight edge, and she numbered them 1 through 11. Thurman Vandiver came over for 9 of the 11. He stayed on the field road. That was the arrangement, and it was hers, not his. He offered twice to take the probe, and she told him no both times, and the second time she told him why. If it's your hands on it, Thurman, it's an old man's hunch, she said. If it's mine, it's a landowner's record. So he stood on that road in rubber boots with the Farmall M idling behind him, and when she yelled at depth, he yelled back what his father had told him about that corner of that section 40 years earlier. And she wrote down both, and he did not say one word more than that. That's what an advisor is. He's a man who knows when the work isn't his. Hole number 7 was run on the afternoon of the 17th of May at the southwest corner, where the flooded ground came up against the old farm levee, the one built at the end of the 1940s, the same era as the survey which nobody had thought about in 30 years. It went down through 4 feet 6 inches of sharky clay so tight it took her 22 minutes. And then at 6 feet 2 inches, the pipe dropped 14 inches in about a second and a half and damn near took her off her feet. The return water changed color while she was still catching her balance. She caught 2 gallons of it in a 5-gallon bucket and let it sit while she ran the pipe another 3 feet and hit the same thing again at 9.5. When she came back to the bucket, there was 1.5 inches of sand laid down in the bottom of it. Clean, coarse, well-sorted, rounded grains the way grains get rounded when a river has rolled them for a couple hundred miles. River sand, the kind of sand a man hauls in on a truck to make concrete out of. 6 feet under a sharky clay soybean field in Dunklin County, Missouri, where there is no sand at that depth on any soil survey the federal government ever printed on that township. Nadine Renfro stood in her own flooded field with a bucket in her hand and knew completely and finally that she was right. And she also knew standing right there that being right by itself was worth exactly nothing. Kent Stanton came out on the 20th of May. He came alone, which was the first interesting thing about it. No consultants, no rolled blueprints, nobody with a laser level. He parked at the end of the lane in a truck that was still too new for that road and walked out to her across the levee ridge in dress boots that were about to stop being dress boots. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood in a courthouse and let a room laugh. He said, "Mrs. Renfro, I'd like to see whatever it is you think you have." She didn't answer him. She reached into the bucket in the back of the truck, took out a double handful of wet sand and held it out toward him. He looked at it. "Take it," she said. He put his hands out and she poured it into them, and it was heavy and it was cold, and it started running out between his fingers immediately the way sand does. "That's sand," he said. "It is." So it came up out of the ground under my beans at 6'2". She wiped her hands on her jeans. "There's no sand at that depth in this section, Mr. Stanton. There's sharky clay, and then there's more sharky clay. You can go look at every soil survey the government ever printed on this county, and you will not find a sand lens under Section 14. Kent Stanton stood there with both hands full of her evidence and did not say one word. "Your consultant told the commission the channel isn't there because a 1971 airplane couldn't see it." Nadine's voice never went up. It did not go up one time that entire spring, which is a large part of why people remembered it. "That airplane was photographing a field my husband's daddy filled in with a pan in 1963. Of course it couldn't see it." She pointed down at his hands. "That's what's under it." Kent let the sand fall. He brushed his palms together slowly twice and looked out across 40 acres of standing water at a line of drowned fence posts going off toward the west ditch, and something in his face changed in a way that Nadine noticed and did not comment on. "I'd like a copy of your probe log," he said. "You'd like a copy of my probe log?" "Yes, ma'am." "So you can hand it to Dr. Kroll and have it taken apart in front of the commission." "Maybe," he said, and then, or maybe not. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the truck, came back with the spiral notebook, tore out 11 pages, and gave them to him. "Have you ever handed the only thing you had to the one person most likely to use it against you? Not because you trusted them, because you had run out of other people to hand it to. That isn't courage exactly. That's closer to arithmetic, too." The Dunklin County Commission met on the 24th of May and voted 2-1 to accept Dr. Kroll's report and take no further action on the Renfro complaint. The finding ran 3 paragraphs. It said the 1948 reconnaissance was of historical interest, but had been superseded by more modern survey work. It said the western berm met all applicable permit conditions and that the January inspection found no violations. And it said the commission encouraged the parties to resolve the matter privately. That last sentence is the one Nadine underlined when she got home. Encourage the parties to resolve the matter privately. There were 2 parties. One of them had 42 trucks and a doctorate on retainer. The lawsuit came 4 days later, and it did not come for her. It came for Thurman Vandiver. Ashmore Aggregates Incorporated versus Vandiver. Tortious interference with business expectancy. The petition alleged that the defendant, a 72-year-old adjoining landowner, had made repeated and knowingly false statements regarding subsurface conditions to county officials, county employees, and third parties, resulting in delay and disruption of a permitted commercial operation and consequential damages. They asked for $41,000. Now listen to what that lawsuit actually was, because it was never about the money, and every single person involved understood that. Ashmore could not sue Nadine Renfro. She was the injured landowner. Suing her would have looked precisely like what it was, and it would have handed her a counterclaim, a courtroom discovery, and a Dunklin County jury pool made up almost entirely of people who farm bottom ground. So they sued the old man standing next to her, $41,000 against a man who farmed 160 acres and drove a tractor his father bought in 1949. It was not a demand for payment. It was a message, and the message was addressed to every single person in that county who might have been thinking about standing anywhere near Nadine Renfro in public. It worked too. Attendance at the Hornersville Cafe got noticeably thin that week. Thurman hired a lawyer out of Poplar Bluff on the 30th of May and paid a $5,000 retainer. He did not have $5,000. What he had was 11 acres on the north end of his place, along the county road, the highest, driest ground he owned, the piece his daddy always said was the only part of that farm you could ever build a house on. He sold it to a man from Campbell for $6,200, and he did not tell a living soul. And Nadine Renfro did not find out about it until the middle of September. Let me tell you about Thurman Vandiver. He had never held an office. He had never sued anybody or been sued. In 72 years, his name had appeared in the Daily Dunklin Democrat exactly 3 times twice in grain reports, and once in 1978 when his wife died. On the 28th of May, 1983, it appeared on the front page under the word defendant. He read the paper at his kitchen table. He folded it in half and set it on the counter. Then he went out and greased the farm all because it was 8 o'clock in the morning, and that was the 8 o'clock work. Some men fall apart. Some men do the 8 o'clock work at 8 o'clock. The foreclosure notice went up on the 2nd of June. Lowell Prentice did it by the book, and that was the whole thing about Lowell Prentice. He never once in his life did anything that was not by the book. Notice of intent to foreclose under the deed of trust, posted at the courthouse door in Kennett, published in the legal section of the Democrat for 3 consecutive weeks sale date, set for the 2nd Tuesday in August. 83 acres, bottomland, bordered by a shallow creek. Improvements dwelling machine shed grain bin. Nadine drove to town and read it on the courthouse door with a dozen people watching her read it. Then she walked across the square to Farmers Trust and asked to see Lowell Prentice and was told he was in a meeting. She waited an hour and 10 minutes in that lobby. He came out at 4:30 because the bank closed at 4:30 and there was nowhere else in the building for him to be. Nadine, Lowell. He was a heavy man in his 50s with his reading glasses pushed up on top of his head and a habit of touching his necktie when he was uncomfortable. He touched it. "You know this isn't personal." "I know it isn't personal to you," she said. He didn't have anything for that. "I read the option contracts," Nadine said. "Down at the recorders, broker of record on all 3. Kelso, Duckworth, and the 80 the Lamberts have on the West Ditch. Every one of them underwater this spring, and every one of them priced 30% back of the township." Prentice's hand came up to the tie again. "Brokerage is a licensed activity," he said. "It's disclosed. It's legal." "I didn't say it wasn't legal." "Then what are you saying?" Nadine put her hat on. "I'm saying I finally understand the whole thing," she said. "Nobody wants my farm, Lowell. My farm's nothing. What somebody wants is a corridor. 4 places in a row on top of the best sand deposit in this end of the county, bought at flood prices off of people who are too tired to argue about it." She looked at him. "And I'm just the one who didn't get tired on schedule." She walked out. She signed the listing agreement on the 6th of June. That's the part of this that nobody expected, and it's the part most people got wrong afterward when they retold it. They like to say she never quit. That is not true, and the true version is better. She quit. She sat at a folding table in a realtor's office on the square in Kennett on the afternoon of Monday, June 6, 1983, and signed a 6-month exclusive listing on the farm Delmar Renfro bought in May of 1968 for $46,800 and paid off across 15 years of soybeans winter wheat in doing without. asking $61,000. The realtor, who was decent about it and did not enjoy his afternoon either, said quietly that at that price and in that condition, it would sell to a gravel company inside of 30 days. Nadine said she understood that. She drove home and told Tanya they'd be moving to her sister's place in Malden as soon as school let out. And Tanya, 14 years old, who had by then spent 8 weeks being asked whether her mama had learned to swim, yet said, "Okay, mama," and went into her room and shut the door and did not come out for supper. That night, Nadine started packing the machine shed, and that is where this whole thing turns. The welding toolbox had been bolted under the seat of the John Deere 420 since Delmar built it in 1976 out of quarter-inch scrap off a bin floor. 2 gate hinges, a hasp with no lock on it, the whole thing hung under the seat pan where it stayed dry no matter what the weather did. It had been sitting there untouched since October of 1981. Not hidden. Nadine had known it was there the entire time, the way you know a room in your own house is there. She had not opened it in 20 months. And you know why. Anybody who has lost somebody knows why. There is a drawer in every house in this country that does not get opened. And it isn't because the person can't get it open. It's because as long as it stays shut, there is one place left in the world where nothing has changed yet. On the night of June 7th, 1983, packing out a machine shed, she had 3 weeks left in Nadine. Renfro knelt on that concrete floor with a drop light hanging off the fender and opened it. Rod, gloves, a wire brush, a spare set of ignition points still in the little box part number written on the lid in his handwriting. And underneath all of it, lying flat on the bottom, a manila envelope gone soft at the corners from 4 years of shed air. Inside the envelope, a carbon copy of a typed letter, 2 pages, a green postal return receipt card, and a quart mason jar with a zinc lid. The letter was dated March 19, 1979. It was addressed to the Dunklin County Commission, Kennett, Missouri. It was signed Delmar A. Renfro in ballpoint over the typed name. And it started the way a farmer starts a letter when he isn't sure anybody's ever going to read it, by apologizing for the length before he has written anything at all. Nadine sat down on the shed floor with her back against the tractor tire and read it under the drop light. He wrote that he had farmed the same 83 acres for 11 years. He wrote that beginning around 1976, he had noticed water rising in the southwest corner of Section 14 in years with no unusual rainfall, sometimes 2 weeks after a rain, sometimes when the creek was running low. He wrote that he had probed the ground himself with a length of pipe and found coarse sand at approximately 6 feet. He wrote that his neighbor, Mr. Vandiver, had told him about a county survey from August of 1948 showing an old overflow channel of the Mississippi running northeast to southwest beneath both of their properties, and that he had gone and looked at it in the courthouse basement, and it was there. And then he wrote the paragraph she read 4 times. He wrote that if anybody ever placed fill or an embankment across that channel upstream of the Renfro place, the water in that sand would have no place left to go, and it would come up through the fields under pressure, and no amount of surface drainage would ever stop it, because the water would not be coming from the sky. He asked the commission to note the channel in their records before somebody permitted something across it. The last line of the letter was this: "I am not asking for anything to be done to my benefit. I am asking that it be written down." The green return receipt was stamped, "Received Dunklin County Clerk, March 22, 1979, and signed by a clerk whose name she didn't recognize. There was no reply in that envelope. There was no reply because there had never been one. Her husband wrote that letter 4 years and 2 months before the water came over her porch. He typed it on a rented typewriter. He mailed it certified and paid the extra 35 cents for the return receipt because he wanted proof somebody had touched it. He got the card back and he filed it. And then a county that had a great deal going on that spring put it in a folder, and Delmar Renfro put his carbon copy in a welding box under a tractor seat and went back to work and never mentioned it to anybody again, because there was nothing else to be done about it. And he was not a man who talked about things there was nothing to be done about. The mason jar had about 2 inches of sand in it, dry, clean, coarse, rounded, 4 years old, and wrapped around the jar and held on with a rubber band gone stiff and cracked was a strip of feed sack paper with 8 words on it in pencil In Delmar Renfro's blocky, careful, right-handed print, "Water don't forget where it used to live." Nadine Renfro sat on the floor of that machine shed for a long time. I have told a lot of stories about people finding something after somebody dies. It's usually money. Sometimes it's a deed. Sometimes it's a letter that explains a thing that never got explained. This was none of those. What she found on the 7th of June was that she had not started this fight. She had walked into the middle of one that her husband started 4 years earlier and lost quietly by himself without ever telling her a word about it. He didn't tell her because he didn't want her carrying it. He was 39 years old when he wrote that letter with a wife and a 10-year-old and a note at the PCA, and he decided that the right thing to do with a warning nobody answered was to fold it up and put it under a tractor seat and not put it on her. And that is a particular species of grief that does not have a good name in the English language, finding out that somebody protected you from something you would have been better at fighting than he was. She sat there until the drop light got hot enough to smell. Then she got up, took the manila envelope in one hand, in the mason jar in the other, walked up to the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and pulled the listing agreement out of the drawer she'd put it in the day before. She read it through once, then she tore it in half and in half again and dropped the pieces in the trash can under the sink. It was 11:40 at night on the 7th of June, 1983. She had 8 days until the final plant date and 23 days until $19,400 came due, and she had less money in the world than she'd had in April. And for the first time since the water came over that porch, Nadine Renfro was not defending anything. If you have ever had the moment where losing stopped being the thing you were afraid of, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me down in the comments. Those are the ones I read twice. Kent Stanton found it on the 9th of June in a file room in a leased office building in Kennett at 9:40 at night with the door locked and the blinds pulled down. He had been at it 4 days, ever since he stood in a flooded field with 2 hands full of somebody else's sand. Here is what he was looking for. Every aggregate operation in Missouri that excavates below the water table has to file a geotechnical report with the state. Boring log soil classification, groundwater observations. Laboratory results, the whole package stamped by a licensed engineer. Ashmore had filed theirs in November of 1981, prepared by a firm out of Memphis and Kent, had read the state copy a dozen times since April because it was the single document that said the western berm was fine. The state copy ran 41 pages. On the 9th of June, going through a banker's box of pre-permit working files that had followed the project up from the Memphis office 2 years earlier, Kent Stanton found the transmittal draft. It ran 42. The extra sheet was numbered 14. It was the boring log for hole B7 drilled on the 6th of October, 1981 on the west side of the pit. The exact ground the western berm was built across 11 months later. The log showed stiff clay down to 5 feet 9 inches, and then from 5 feet 9 to 14 feet 2, it showed SP, poorly graded sand, fine to coarse, rounded, saturated, standing water in the hole. And over in the remarks column typed by some field engineer in Memphis who had no earthly idea what he was typing into history were 4 words: possible relic channel deposit. Kent sat down in a folding chair in that file room and laid the state copy and the working draft side by side on a table. Page 13 in both, identical. Page 14 in the draft was B7. Page 14 in the state filing was the next log B8 renumbered. And when he checked the running footer, the page count had been retyped. Not photocopied over, retyped on a different machine with the letter E sitting slightly high. Somebody had pulled one sheet of paper out of a 42-page report, renumbered everything behind it, retyped the footers, and filed the short version with the state of Missouri. And then a permit had been issued on the basis of a document with no sand in it. And then a company had built an earthen embankment directly across a buried river channel and had been genuinely, sincerely, completely astonished when water started coming up in a widow's field 3 miles down the county. Let me be plain about something because this is where a lot of these stories go wrong. Kent Stanton was not a villain. He was 32 years old and running grade for a highway contractor in Cape Girardeau when that report was filed in 1981. He had been at Ashmore 14 months. He had stood up in a courthouse in April and told a woman that flood-prone ground carries a risk and that she ought to consider selling, and he had believed every word of it because the document in his hand said clay to 40 feet, and it had a licensed engineer's stamp in the corner. That's how it almost always is. It is hardly ever a room full of people deciding to drown somebody. It's one man pulling one page in 1981 and 40 other people doing their jobs correctly on top of it for 2 years. Kent made 3 photocopies of page 14. He put one in his truck. He put one in a safe deposit box at a bank that was not Farmers Trust of Kennet. And he put the third one in an envelope that he did not mail. He didn't mail it because mailing it was the easy version. An envelope is a thing a man can do at night with the blinds down and never have to look anybody in the face about. The version that was actually going to cost him something was going to have to happen out loud in a room with his own employer's consultant, sitting 8 feet away, and 2 witnesses from state government at the same table. He did not know that yet. He'd know it in 8 days. Nadine Renfro walked into the Dunklin County Clerk's office at 8:15 on the morning of Friday, June 10th, with a manila envelope under her arm. She did not ask for the commission. She did not ask for a hearing. She did not ask for a lawyer. She asked the clerk for the file stamp log for March of 1979. Now, here is a thing about county government that almost nobody outside of it understands, and it is the hinge that this entire story swings on. A county commission is allowed to be wrong. It can vote wrong. It can hire the wrong consultant. It can read the wrong map and reach the wrong conclusion and issue a permit it shouldn't have. Being wrong is not by itself a liability. That is what elections are for. But notice is a different animal entirely. When a governmental body receives written notice of a specific hazard at a specific location on a specific piece of ground and files it and takes no action, and then 4 years later issues a permit for construction directly across that exact hazard, that is not a mistake anymore. That is a documented failure to act on known information. And if the thing you were warned about goes on and hurts somebody, there is not a lawyer in 3 states who won't read that 1979 letter out loud to a jury slowly, 1 paragraph at a time. Nadine laid Delmar's letter on the counter, then the green return receipt with the county's own stamp across it. Then she asked for the March 1979 file log, and the clerk brought it, and Nadine opened it to the 22nd, where a clerk 4 years gone had entered it in longhand. Renfro D., a correspondence redrenage, section 14 to commissioner, received, logged, never answered. The clerk read, it went white around the mouth, and walked out of the room to go get the presiding commissioner out of a different meeting. The presiding commissioner read it standing up, which is how you can always tell a man is understanding something faster than he wants to. Then he asked Nadine Renfro in a voice she described afterward as extremely polite, whether she had provided a copy of this letter to anybody else. And Nadine Renfro, 39 years old in her husband's work boots, with 83 acres underwater, a foreclosure sale set for the second Tuesday in August, and 21 days until her note came due, said not yet. The county ordered core drilling that afternoon. Not a review, not a study, not a request for a proposal. Drilling with the county's own money on an emergency purchase order signed at 4 o'clock by a rig out of Sykeston that was on the ground at 7 the next morning. They drilled 4 holes along the landward toe of the Ashmore Western Berm on the 11th and 12th of June. Every one of them found the same thing: stiff, sharky clay from the surface down to somewhere between 5 and 6 feet. And then sand. Clean, coarse, saturated, rounded sand running from roughly 6 feet down to 14 in a band about 230 yards wide, oriented northeast to southwest, which is to say exactly where a hand-drawn linen map dated August 12, 1948, said an abandoned overflow channel of the Mississippi River ran, and exactly where a boring log dated October 6, 1981, said possible relic channel deposit on a page that never reached Jefferson City. But it was not the sand that emptied the color out of that levee. It was the last measurement. They set a standpipe in hole 3 on the dry side of the berm. Just a length of pipe open at the bottom, grouted through the clay, so nothing could leak down alongside it, screened only in the sand. That's called a piezometer. It is the simplest instrument in all of geotechnical engineering, and it does exactly one thing: it tells you how hard the water down there is pushing. Water rose in that pipe to 4 feet 3 inches above the ground surface. Above it, standing in the air in a pipe in the middle of a soybean field with no pump anywhere on the property. Let me explain what that means, because this is the moment where this story stops being about one farm and starts being about 788 people. Go back to the buried sand in the clay lid. Raise the water at the upstream end by ponding runoff behind an 1,100-foot berm sitting on top of it, and every year add a little more. And the water down in that sand goes under pressure, and it pushes out in all directions, looking for the weakest spot in the lid. 4 feet 3 inches above ground surface means that 3 miles from the pit, the water in that buried channel was pushing up against the underside of Nadine Renfro's field, hard enough to stand a column of water 4 feet in the air if you gave it a pipe to stand in. It also means the water that drowned her farm never once came over the top of anything. It came up through the floor. And here is the part that made a drilling foreman out of Sykeston take his hard hat off on the morning of the 12th of June and stand there holding it in both hands. A levee, any levee anywhere in the world, does not usually fail by water coming over the top. That's how it looks in the movies. It's the rare case. Levees fail from underneath. It's called underseepage, and then it's called piping, and it goes like this. Pressurized water down in a sand layer finds a weak point on the dry side of the embankment and starts moving up through it. As it moves, it picks up a few grains of sand and carries them along. Those grains leave behind a channel that is very slightly wider than it was. A wider channel moves more water. More water carries more sand. More sand makes a wider channel. On the surface, what you see is a little cone of wet sand, maybe 6 inches across, bubbling gently like a spring in a pasture. Farmers up and down the Mississippi have had a name for that for 100 years. A sand boil. A sand boil is not a leak. A sand boil is an embankment eating itself from below 1 grain at a time. And when that channel finally connects all the way through, the levee does not crack, and it does not seep, and it does not give you a warning. It collapses in about 90 seconds. That foreman found 11 sand boils along the landward toe of the Ashmore Western Berm on the morning of June 12th. 2 of them were flowing hard enough to have built cones of sand 9 inches high. He walked that toe with the county engineer for 40 minutes, and then he came back to the trucks and took his hard hat off and said quietly to nobody in particular, "If this keeps rising, that berm won't hold." Kent Stanton was standing 8 feet away. And here is why that sentence went through everybody on that levee like cold water. The Ashmore pit sits on the high side. Below the western berm, past the Renfro, 83, past the Vandiver Place, past the West Ditch, the ground falls away for 4.5 miles to the southwest. And down at the bottom of that fall out in the flat sits the town of Cardwell, Missouri. Population by the 1980 census, 788. A grade school, a nursing home with 19 residents in it, 200 and some houses, most of them on slabs, most of them built in the 50s, not one of them more than a single story. Between that pit and that town, there was no second levee. There had never needed to be one. There had never been anything up there to hold back. Nobody had drowned anybody on purpose. Nobody had ever sat in a conference room and decided a town was expendable. It was just that in 1981, a page came out of a report, and in 1982, a berm went up across a river channel that nobody knew was there, and in the spring of 1983, it rained. That's how it almost always is. It is never a decision. It is a stack of small, ordinary things that nobody stacked on purpose. Deputy Lyle Suggs came down the field road at 4:20 in the afternoon on the 15th of June. He was a big man and a slow one, and he took his hat off before he read it, which is how everybody standing there knew it was serious. By order of the Dunklin County Commission, effective immediately, all operations on the Ashmore Aggregates Western Impoundment are suspended pending emergency hydrologic and geotechnical review. No excavation, no fill placement, no alteration of the existing berm structure by any party pending further order of this commission. Kent Stanton read it twice and said there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. He said the project had state approval. Deputy Suggs said it still did. He said the county had come into some new information. He said the commission voted at 2 o'clock and that he had been told to hand deliver it to everybody on the list before dark. Then he folded the paper, put his hat back on, and looked out across 83 acres of standing water at a house with a kitchen light on in it. Thurman Vandiver, 72 years old, defendant in a $41,000 lawsuit, 11 acres poorer than he had been 3 weeks earlier. And not one soul in the world knowing it nodded once. Not in victory, just in acknowledgement. Nadine Renfro took the copy Deputy Suggs handed her. read all 4 paragraphs of it, folded it, and put it in her jacket pocket. She did not smile, because she had just done a piece of arithmetic that nobody else standing on that levee had gotten around to yet, and it went like this. That order stopped Ashmore from making it worse. That is all it did. It did not open the ground. It did not release one single gallon of pressure out of that buried channel. The water standing on her farm was going to keep standing there, and the 11 sand boils at the toe of that berm were going to keep eating. And every hour of every day, the head in that sand was going to keep building, because nothing in that piece of paper told the water anything at all. It was the 15th of June. The final plant date on her crop insurance policy expired at midnight. There would be no 1983 soybean crop on the Renfro place. Not a late one. Not a poor one. None. The note came due in 16 days. The order in her jacket pocket had proved her right publicly, officially in writing, with the county's own drill rig and the county's own money. And it had arrived exactly one growing season too late to save a single thing she owned. Have you ever gotten the thing you asked for on the exact day it stopped being able to help you? Nadine walked back up the field road toward the house in her husband's boots, past a machine shed where a 1956 John Deere sat with an empty welding box under the seat, and a mason jar of 4-year-old sand on the workbench beside it. Behind her, 3 miles up the county, 4 feet 3 inches of pressure was standing in a 2-inch pipe with nowhere on God's earth to go. And the rain was forecast to start again Friday. It started at 10 minutes after 4 on the morning of Friday, June 17, 1983, and by 6 o'clock, the Dunklin County Emergency Management Office had a man standing on the west toe of that berm counting sand boils, out loud into a handheld radio. He got to 19 and quit counting. Not because there weren't more, because the 2 big ones down at Station 4+50 had grown cones of sand 14 inches high overnight, and they were not seeping anymore. They were running. Nadine Renfro was already up. She'd been up since 3 every night that week, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug going cold in front of her, and Delmar's 1979 letter flattened out under a mason jar of sand, because that jar was the only paperweight in the house that meant anything. At 6:40, the phone rang. It was the county engineer, and he asked her whether she could be at the shop building at the County Road Barn in Kennett by 8 o'clock. He asked it in the voice of a man who had been awake all night and had run out of good options somewhere around 4 in the morning. She said she could. Then she woke Tanya and told her to go to her aunt's in Malden and to take the photo albums in the shoebox out of the closet in the front room. Tanya asked nothing at all. She had stopped asking questions about the water somewhere around the middle of May. She was gone in 20 minutes with a laundry basket on the back seat. That's the thing about farm kids. They know the difference between an argument and an evacuation. There were 14 people in the county road barn at 8 o'clock. The presiding commissioner and both associates, the county engineer, a district man from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources who had driven up from Poplar Bluff in the dark, Deputy Lyle Suggs standing by the door because that is where he always stood, the drilling foreman out of Sykeston, Dr. Adele Kroll in Kent Stanton for Ashmore Aggregates, Nadine Renfro in her husband's work boots, and Thurman Vandiver, 72 years old, who had not been invited and had driven himself there anyway, and whom nobody had the heart to tell to leave. The county engineer put a plat on the table and gave them the situation in about 90 seconds with no decoration on it at all. The buried channel under the western berm was under artesian head. The piezometer in hole 3 had gone from 4 feet 3 inches above ground surface on the 12th to 5 feet 11 that morning. 19 boils along the landward toe, 2 of them actively transporting material. Rain in the forecast through Sunday 1 to 3 inches. He said the berm had a design life measured in years and a remaining life he'd personally put somewhere between 4 days and about 40 minutes. Then he said the part they had all come to hear. They could not pump it down. There is no pump on this earth that will draw down a confined aquifer. You'd be pumping the Mississippi Valley. They could not armor 19 boils fast enough. A sandbag ring around a boil buys you hours, and they had 19 in a rain coming. And they could not take the berm out because pulling an embankment with a dozer releases everything ponded behind it in one shot and puts a wall of water into the exact ground they were trying to protect. What they could do was cut a relief channel, one controlled opening down through the clay lid and into the sand at a place where the pressure could bleed off into a drainage way that would carry it somewhere it belonged. Do that in the right spot, and 40 years of headwalks out of the ground like air out of a tire. Do it in the wrong spot, and you have handed 50 million gallons of shortcut straight into the toe of the embankment you are trying to save, and after that, you are not managing anything. The engineer looked around that table. So the only question in front of us this morning, he said, is where? Let me stop right here for a second because a lot of you have worked around water your whole lives, and you already know exactly what that sentence means, and some of you have never once had to think about it. Everything in this story, the flood, the courthouse, the laughter, the lawsuit against an old man, a farm on the sale list for the second Tuesday in August, a town of 788 people, 4.5 miles downhill. All of it collapses down to one X on one piece of paper on a folding table in a road barn in the rain. And there were exactly 2 people in that county willing to put an X down. Dr. Adele Kroll went first. She wanted the cut at the northeast end up close to the pit in the area where the boring data was densest. Her reasoning was sound and she laid it out in 4 minutes without a note in front of her. Cut close to the source. Cut in ground you have physically measured. Work off a bench in a haul road you already have in the rain with equipment that's already sitting there. Everything about it was defensible. Everything about it was also built on a set of borings with a page missing out of them, and exactly one person in that room knew it. Then the engineer looked down the table. Mrs. Renfro. She put her notebook on the table. 11 probe holes. Depth to change color, feel date time of day, in a farm wife's handwriting, with the tops of the pages torn ragged where she had ripped out a copy for a man she'd had no reason on earth to trust. Beside it, she laid out 39 inches of linen from August of 1948, brittle as a dead leaf. And beside that, the plat she had traced off it by hand at her own kitchen table with a pencil and a straight edge. She put her finger down on the southwest. Here, she said. The engineer asked her why. And this is the part that men who have farmed 40 years in that county still talk about at the cafe in Hornersville, and I want to give it to you the way it happened. Nadine Renfro did not argue with Dr. Kroll's science. She never did, not one time the entire spring. She said because at the northeast end, that channel's under 30 foot of overburden and it's headed toward the berm. You cut up there, you're opening it upstream of your own problem. Everything you turn loose has still got to come past that levee to get anywhere. She moved her finger down the traced blue line. Down here at the southwest corner of section 14, the channel comes up. There isn't but 6 foot of clay on top of it. And I know that because I put a pipe through it 11 times in May, and hole 7 dropped 14 inches in a second and a half at 6'2", and I've got the sand in a bucket in the back of my truck if anybody in here wants to hold it. She looked up. And 200 yards past that, it runs into a slough. My husband's daddy quit farming in 1961 because it would not dry out no matter what he did to it. That slough drains south to the west ditch. It's already a channel. It's been a channel since before anybody in this room was born. She tapped the paper once. You wouldn't be building an outlet. You'd be unplugging one. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Dr. Adele Kroll said not unkindly that it was an interesting proposal, but that it rested on a 1948 reconnaissance and 11 uncased hand probes, and that she could not in good professional conscience recommend a relief cut in a location where she had no boring data whatsoever. And that would have been the end of it. That would have been the end of it, and they would have cut at the northeast end, and I would be telling you a very different story with a town in it. Except that Kent Stanton stood up, 34 years old, 14 months with the company, a house note, a truck note, and a fiancé in Cape Girardeau. Before there's a vote, he said, there's something in our file that ought to be on that table. Then he laid down page 14. He didn't read it out loud. He turned it around so it faced the county engineer, put one finger on the remarks column, and waited. The engineer read 4 words to himself. Then he read them again out loud because there was no other way to make that room believe them. Kent set the state file copy down beside it, open to the same page number, and let 14 people look at 2 documents where one of them had a hole in it. Our own rig drilled that hole in October of '81, he said, 11 months before we built across it. It never went to Jefferson City. Somebody renumbered around it and retyped the footer. That was the envelope he had been carrying in his truck since the 9th of June. He never did mail it. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain coming down on the shop roof. Dr. Adele Kroll picked up both documents and held them side by side at arm's length for about 20 seconds. She was not a dishonest woman. I want to be fair to her because it would be easy not to be. She had been handed a stamped report and asked a narrow question, and she had answered that narrow question correctly. And she had built a professional opinion on a foundation that somebody removed a brick from before she ever laid eyes on it. She set them down on the table. The 1948 survey is consistent with B7, she said. So is Mrs. Renfro's probe log. And then she said the 5 words that cost her the account. I'd cut where she says. The Dunklin County Commission voted at 9:22 in the morning on the 17th of June, 1983. 3-0. They started moving equipment at 11, and by noon, everybody in the south end of that county knew there was going to be a cut made on the Renfro place. And that is when the second thing happened, the one that had nothing at all to do with engineering. Because there were still 60 acres of water standing on that farm, and it was still raining, and the machine shed sat on a rise that was by then about 9 inches of ground above a lake. And inside that shed sat the little green tractor she had pulled her probe with in May. You already know what it cost, and what he traded for it, and what year he brought it home. Here's the part I left out. The steel seat on that tractor is worn through the paint in one place on the left side, only because a man sat crooked on it for 11 years on account of a hip that never did set right after a hay wagon rolled on him in 1969. Delmar Renfro was 41 years old the third week of October 1981. He shut that tractor off at the end of a round. He stepped down off the left side the way he always did. He started across the stubble toward the combine, and he did not get there. To anybody in that county, it was an outdated utility tractor worth maybe $1,100 on a good day. It was the last machine he ever had his hands inside of. Hoyt Tillery came up that lane at 1:15 in the afternoon in the elevator's flatbed truck with a chain hoist, 4 logging chains, and 200 feet of cable, and he climbed out and stood in the rain in front of a woman he had turned down at a counter 5 weeks earlier. He said, "I was wrong." Nadine said, "You were doing your job." "No," Hoyt said. "I did Lowell Prentice's job for him. There's a difference, and I've known it since the day you walked out of my scale house." Then he asked her what needed moving first, and Nadine Renfro told him, and he went to work. Have you ever watched a man you had already written off come back and do the exact thing that costs him something? That is harder than most people know. It is a great deal easier to be right the first time than it is to come back after being wrong in front of the whole county. Hoyt Tillery came back. By 2 o'clock, there were 9 trucks in that yard. By 3, there were 22. I want to be careful here because this is the part of stories like this that people don't believe. And it is the part I have found is almost always true. Nobody organized it. There was no phone tree. There was no church committee and no announcement. What happened was that Hoyt Tillery's flatbed went up the Renfro lane at 1:15 in the afternoon, where 40 people could see it from the county road, and in a farm town that is a public statement, and every single person who saw it understood it instantly. They came with flatbed trailers and fuel cans and come-alongs and chain binders. Somebody brought a hay wagon. 2 of the Duckworth boys, whose own father had signed an option contract in January, came with an 18-foot John boat and a 9-horse Evinrude and ferried 5-gallon buckets of hand tools out of that shed for 4 solid hours. Somebody's wife set up a card table under the shed overhang and made coffee on a Coleman stove until dark. Not one man there asked about money. Not one of them brought it up. And at 2:40 that afternoon, a Ford pickup with an Ashmore Aggregates decal on the door came up the lane, and a 26-year-old shop mechanic named Dwayne Ottinger got out of it with his own toolbox in his hands. He had quit at noon. He told Nadine he was the man who ran the gate on the Western Impoundment. The slide gate she had watched through her father's binoculars from a bridge approach on a county road in April, the one that got closed before every storm and opened up after it passed. He said he'd been told it was to keep runoff out of the pit and protect the plant, and that he had believed that because it was true. He said he had asked twice in writing where the water went when that gate was shut. He said he'd been told twice that it wasn't his department. He said he had a wife and a baby coming in September, and he had just walked away from a job with insurance on it, and that he'd do it again. Then he asked what needed moving first. Nadine pointed at the shed. Kent Stanton got there at 4. He had been at the cut site all day. He walked up that rise in the rain in dress boots that were finished as footwear, and he stood in the shed doorway looking at a barn full of people and a woman sitting on a milk crate with a socket set, and he asked the same question everybody else had asked. What needs moving first? Somebody said the combine, and it was a reasonable answer. It was the single most valuable thing on that place, an 11-year-old gleaner worth maybe $8,000, and the water was 6 inches from the rear axle. Nadine Renfro put her hand flat on the hood of the 420. The combine can be replaced, she said. She left her hand where it was. This can't. Nobody in that shed argued with her. Now let me tell you how you bring a tractor back that has been sitting in a damp shed in a flood. Because there are men listening to this who have done it, and there are men listening to this whose fathers did it and never once showed them how, and it is worth writing down. The little John Deere would not start. It had run fine on the 19th of May, pulling that jetting probe. It had sat 4 weeks since in a shed at 98% humidity with water standing within 20 feet of the doors, and when she hit the starter, it turned about a quarter revolution and stopped dead like it had hit a wall. Thurman Vandiver stood in that doorway with his hat dripping and did not touch it. That was the arrangement, and it was hers, not his. He had held to it through 11 probe holes in a courthouse, in a lawsuit with his own name on the front page, and he held to it in a shed with 20 people watching. He called it out from the door. She did every bit of it. First thing, and this is the one that saves engines, do not crank it again. That quarter turn and stop is the sound of hydraulic lock, and one more push on that starter button will finish that tractor in about a second. Water gets into a cylinder down the exhaust in through the intake past a valve that happened to be sitting open when it shut down, and water does not compress. A starter motor has plenty of torque to bend a connecting rod like a paperclip trying to squeeze it. There are a lot of good engines buried in this country that died from one more try. So Nadine pulled both spark plugs, 2 cylinders horizontal side by side the way that engine is built. Then she put the crank handle on it and turned it over by hand slow, and water came out of the number 1 plug hole in a spray about 18 inches long. And everybody in that shed made the same noise at the same time. She turned it 15 more revolutions until nothing came out but air. Second thing, the oil. She pulled the dipstick and held it under the drop light, and it came out the color of coffee with too much cream in it. That is water emulsified into the oil, and if you start an engine on that, you have no bearing film at all, and you will wipe the rod journals in about 90 seconds of running. She drained it into a dishpan, and about 1.5 quarts of clear water came out ahead of the oil, because water is heavier and it lies in the bottom. Fresh oil out of a case Hoyt Tillery had thrown on that flatbed without being asked. Third thing, the gearbox nobody thinks about. Transmission and final drives breathe. When a hot tractor cools down in a wet shed, it pulls damp air in through the vent, and that moisture condenses and it runs down and sits on the gears where nobody ever looks. She cracked the transmission drain plug a half turn and let it dribble into a coffee can until the color changed from clear to oil and snugged it back down. Fourth thing, fuel. Same story exactly. She drained the sediment bowl and got a 1/2 inch of water sitting under the gasoline, drained the tank petcock until it ran clean, and put in fresh gas out of a can somebody had brought. Fifth thing, and this is the one that saved it, the ignition. Under the distributor cap on that engine sit 2 little tungsten contact points that open and close every time a cylinder fires. They are functionally the entire electrical system in one moving part. And 4 weeks in wet air puts a film of oxide on those contact faces so fine that you cannot see it with your eye, and that film is an insulator, and no spark crosses it, and the engine will crank all day long and never fire. You cannot clean points with sandpaper. Grit embeds itself in tungsten, and they will burn up inside a week. What you use, and every farmer in this country over the age of 60 knows this one is a dollar bill. You fold it once, you slide it between the closed points. You pinch the points together against it with your thumb, and you pull it through 3 or 4 times. Rag paper with just enough fiber to burnish the oxide off and no abrasive at all to leave behind. Then you pull it through once more on a clean part of the bill to take out whatever you knocked loose. Thurman called it out from the doorway. Nadine had $1 in her jacket. She dried the cap and the rotor with a shop rag, wiped down the coil tower, put the plugs back in, and set the choke. First attempt, nothing but crank. Second attempt, it caught ran on one cylinder for maybe 4 seconds, loped and quit. There was a silence in that shed you could have leaned against. Third attempt. The two-cylinder caught on both and settled into that sound, that offbeat, unhurried tractor-shaped sound that anybody who grew up around one can hear right now, this second just from me describing it to you. 20-some people standing in a machine shed in the rain, and not one of them cheered. They just stood there and let it idle. Because some sounds don't mean the machine works. Some sounds mean this isn't over yet. Nadine Renfro stood there with one hand on the fender and did not say a word, and did not let anybody see her face for about a minute and a half. Then she put it in gear and drove it out of that shed and up onto the high ground by the road, and she and Dwayne Ottinger went back in after the combine. If you have ever heard an engine start that carried somebody's memory in it, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what it was and whose it was. Those are the ones I read twice, and there is always somebody scrolling down there who needed to read it worse than I did. They cut on Sunday morning, the 19th of June, 1983. 2D6 dozers and a track hoe out of Kennett. The county engineer staked it at daylight, running southwest off the corner of Section 14, and the stakes went in a line that started 12 feet from Nadine Renfro's probe hole number 7 and ran 210 yards to the head of a slough that a man had given up on in 1961. The design was simple, the way good designs generally are. A trench 8 feet wide in the bottom, cut down through the clay lid, and about 3 feet into the sand. Spoil piled on the downhill side to make a low guide bank. No structure, no gate, no pipe, nothing to maintain, and nothing to fail. Just an opening in a lid. By 9:40 in the morning, there were maybe 80 people standing along that county road. Word travels. Cardwell had gotten a courtesy call from the sheriff's office on Friday night, not an evacuation order, just a stay near your phone, and a town of 788 people does not sleep well after a call like that. Half of Cardwell was on that road. So was most of Hornersville. So was a reporter from the Democrat and a photographer who had driven down from Sykeston. Lowell Prentice was there. He stood up by the bridge in a raincoat with his hands behind his back, and I want to be fair to the man and say I do not know what he came for. Maybe he came because everybody came. Maybe he came because his name was on 3 option contracts and a foreclosure notice, and he wanted to see how it landed. Thurman Vandiver parked the Farmall M on the shoulder and stayed up on the seat because a 72-year-old man with a lawsuit against him had learned that spring where it was smart to stand. Kent Stanton stood with the county engineer. Nadine Renfro stood by herself at the head of the cut. The track hoe made the last pass at 11:18. The operator broke through the bottom of the clay, pulled the bucket back, swung the machine, and backed off the spoil bank. The engineer waved everybody up the slope. And then there was nothing to do but look at a trench. Water stood in the bottom of it, maybe 8 inches of it, brown and perfectly still. Nothing happened. 1 minute, 2. Somebody up on the road said something and somebody else laughed. And it was not a cruel laugh. It was the other kind, the nervous kind that comes out when a crowd is committed to something and it isn't happening. 5 minutes. The photographer from Sykeston put his camera down at his side. 8 minutes. The county engineer walked down the spoil bank, looked into that trench, and walked back up without saying anything to anybody. And if you have ever watched an engineer decline to say something, you know exactly how loud that is. 10 minutes. And people started to leave. That's the detail I want you to hold on to because it is the true one, and it is the one that never makes it into stories like this. They didn't boo. Nobody yelled anything at her. They just started drifting back toward their trucks the way people do when a thing has quietly failed, and nobody wants to be standing there when it gets officially announced. Doors opening, engine starting, that specific sound of an event ending. And Lowell Prentice said loud to nobody and to everybody in the voice of a man who had been waiting 2 months to say it. Well, there it is. 9 weeks of county drill rig and $40,000 of the taxpayers' money, and it's a ditch. He wasn't even angry when he said it. He said it the way you'd read a number off a page. Nadine Renfro did not turn around. She stood at the head of that cut in her husband's boots, with her arms down at her sides, And Dr. Adele Kroll, who had lost an account 2 days earlier for saying 5 words in a road barn, walked down and stood next to her, and the two of them looked into a trench with 8 inches of still brown water in the bottom of it. Kroll said quietly, "Confined systems don't respond instantly. There's a plug of fines in that sand face. It has to erode before anything moves." Nadine said, "How long?" And Dr. Adele Kroll, licensed hydrologist, said the most honest thing anybody said out loud that entire spring. "I don't know." Nadine Renfro looked at that trench for a while. Then she said, mostly to herself, "My husband wrote 8 words on a piece of feed sack 4 years ago. Water don't forget where it used to live." She said, "I've got to believe he knew what he was talking about because everything else I've got is spent." At 12 minutes past the hour, the ground shivered. Not a sound. A feeling the kind you take in through the soles of your boots a half-second before your ears get anything. Half the people still on that road turned around at the same instant, and the ones who had already pulled out stopped in the middle of the county road and got back out of their trucks. Down in the bottom of the trench at the sand face on the northeast wall, the still brown water moved. A cone of it lifted, about the size of a dinner plate. Then it broke, and what came out from underneath it was gray. Gray and moving and carrying, and the cone was a foot across, and then it was 3 feet across. And then the whole northeast wall of that trench let go and slumped forward into the cut. And the water that came out from behind it was not seeping, and it was not welling up. It was coming. Let me tell you what those people were looking at. For something on the order of 40 years, ever since men started putting roads and filling levees across those bottoms in earnest, that buried channel had been slowly filling up like a bathtub with tape over the drain. Every wet spring pushed a little more into it. It couldn't get out the top because 40 feet of sharky clay sat on it like a lid. It couldn't get out the far end because somebody had built across the far end. Then in 1982, a company put an 1,100-foot embankment across the last open piece of it, and in the spring of 1983, it rained for 6 weeks. And by the middle of June, the water down in that sand was pushing with almost 6 feet of head on it. What that trench did was give it a door. And when the fines washed out of the sand face and that door came all the way open, 40 years of pressure came up out of the ground in about 4 minutes. The trench ran full, then it ran over. The guide bank held on the low side, and the water made the turn and went down 210 yards of old slough that had not carried a real flow since Eisenhower. And it went into the west ditch, and the west ditch took it south the way it had been taking water south since the Corps straightened it in 1938. The photographer got one frame that ran on the front page of the Democrat on Monday and got picked up by the AP out of Springfield on Tuesday. And it is not a photograph of water. It is a photograph of about 60 people standing on a county road with their hands down at their sides. Nobody cheered. I have asked people about that over the years, and the answer always comes back some version of the same thing. You don't cheer that. You don't cheer 40 years of somebody's ground coming back out from under a town. It's too big and it's too quiet and it goes on too long. They just stood there and watched it, some of them for 2 hours. And Thurman Vandiver, on the seat of a 1949 Farmall M, 72 years old defendant in a $41,000 lawsuit, 11 acres poorer than he had been 3 weeks earlier, took his hat off. Not for the water. By dark on Sunday, the piezometer in hole 3 had dropped from 5 feet 11 above ground surface to 18 inches above. By Tuesday morning, it read 2 feet below ground surface, and the 19 sand boils along the toe of the Ashmore berm had gone flat and quit every single one of them. The drilling foreman out of Sykeston walked that toe with the county engineer for an hour and pronounced the embankment stable. In Cardwell, Missouri, population 788 went back to sleep without ever knowing exactly how close it came. That's the part that is never in the newspaper. Nothing happened to Cardwell. There is no story in a town that didn't flood. There were people in that town who died 40 years later without ever finding out that the reason their house was still standing on its slab was a farm wife with a length of galvanized conduit and a notebook. On the Renfro place, the water line dropped 18 inches overnight. Another day and a half and the tops of the levee ridges came out. Then the fence posts. Then in long, dark stripes across 60 acres, the drowned rows of the winter wheat she had drilled herself the previous October, a crop she had put in alone on ground, she dissed alone in the second full year of running that farm without him. And then on Wednesday, the 22nd of June, Nadine Renfro walked out into the receding shallows at 7 in the morning and found the fish. Hundreds of them. Crappie, bluegill, channel cat, some of them 14 inches, trapped in the low pockets as the water pulled back, finning in 8 inches of water over the rows of a dead wheat crop in a field 31 miles from the Mississippi River. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she got in the truck and drove up to Thurman Vandiver's place and got him out of the barn without explaining why. He came and stood at the edge of it and started laughing, an old man's laugh, more air in it than sound, and Nadine asked him, "What in the world?" "I was hoping for this," Thurman said. "You knew?" "No, ma'am." He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. "I remembered. My daddy told me the same thing happened out here after the flood of '45. Same corner of the same section. He said you could pick them up in a wash tub. Kent Stanton came out that afternoon. He had been on that ground every day since the cut. He stood at the edge of that shallow water with a couple hundred bluegill working in it, and he said, 'Mrs. Renfro, you were right.'" And Nadine Renfro, who had stood up in a courthouse full of laughing men on the 28th of April and said the quietest true thing anybody said all year, gave him the truest answer she ever gave anybody. "That isn't enough." And she meant it. That is the whole reason it is worth repeating. Being right did not put a crop in 60 acres of ground. Being right did not move the final plant date off the 15th of June. Being right did not take her name off a foreclosure notice tacked to a courthouse door with a sale date of the second Tuesday in August. And it did not put $19,400 on Lowell Prentice's desk by the 1st of July, which was 9 days off. Have you ever won and then gone home and had to figure out how in the world you were going to pay for it? That's most of what winning actually is. It just doesn't photograph well. 3 things happened in the last week of June and the first 2 weeks of July, and they happened in an order that mattered. The first was that a fisheries biologist named Warren Frey came out from the Missouri Department of Conservation on the 28th of June to look at a farm field with a couple hundred fish in it. He spent 2 days and came back on the 3rd with 2 more people. He walked the lowest 22 acres with a hand net, a notebook, and a hip chain, and what he found startled him. Juvenile bluegill and crappie in the thousands using the flooded rows as a nursery, which is precisely the function a river floodplain performs, and which the boot heel had almost entirely stopped performing after 50 years of levying and ditching and straightening. Smartweed and wild millet already germinating on the mudflats behind the receding water, which is duck food and which nobody planted. 230 yards of relic channel and slope hydraulically reconnected for the first time since before the Second World War. Frey told her the state had spent a decade looking for private landowners in the boot heel willing to hold seasonal wetland and had found almost none because bottomland farmers do not volunteer their ground for water. And why on earth would they? Their grandfathers spent their whole lives getting the water off. He told her the lowest 22 acres of the Renfro place had reconstituted themselves without a dollar of state money and without anybody planning it into exactly the thing his department had been trying to build from scratch since 1973. The second thing happened on the 6th of July. The governor's office designated Dunklin and Pemiscot counties as agricultural disaster areas following the June flooding. And that designation tripped a piece of federal machinery that most people have never heard of. And that is the actual reason that farm still exists. The Farmers Home Administration Emergency Disaster Deferral. In a designated county, an eligible borrower with flood-caused crop loss could apply for deferral of principal and interest. And this is the part that mattered. A participating lender holding a note against destroyed collateral could be formally asked to hold acceleration pending the determination. Corinne Shipp filed the paperwork. It was not her job. It was not any part of her job. She drove to Kennett, and she drove to Sykeston, and she drove to the FMHA county office in Malden with a folder on the seat beside her because she had watched that entire spring happen from inside it, and she had picked her side quietly a long time before anybody asked her to. The third thing happened on the 8th of July. The Missouri Department of Conservation issued a letter of intent to Farmers Trust of Kennett over Warren Frey's signature and a regional supervisor's, stating that the department was in active negotiation with the landowner for a wetland agreement and conservation easement covering approximately 22 acres with anticipated first-year consideration in the range of $25,000 to $30,000. Now understand what that letter is. That letter is not money. That letter is a piece of paper saying money is coming. But a bank does not foreclose on a farm with a pending state agreement on it. It cannot, and its own lawyers will tell it so before lunch. The minute that letter came across the counter, the collateral position that Lowell Prentice had used to accelerate that note in April reversed itself completely because the 22 acres that were worthless in April, the wettest, sorriest, lowest ground on that whole place, the acres that drowned first every single year since 1968 were now the only part of that farm with a guaranteed income stream attached to it. The foreclosure was withdrawn on the 11th of July. Nadine Renfro found out about it from the legal notices in the Democrat, same as everybody else in the county. She signed the agreement with the state of Missouri on the 14th of September 1983 at a folding table in a regional office in Poplar Bluff with a pen Warren Frey handed her and never got back. The first payment was $28,600. She paid the note off in full on the 16th, 11 weeks late, with a cashier's check she carried into the lobby of Farmers Trust herself and handed across the counter to a teller. She did not ask to see Lowell Prentice. She did not need to. Now here is where this story usually ends. And here is where this one doesn't. This is the part I most want you to have. The state standard agreement in 1983 ran 10 years. 10-year term renewable at the department's option annual payment. Landowner retains title and full control at the end. Nadine Renfro read it at her kitchen table on the 2nd of September with a mason jar of sand sitting on the corner of it and told Warren Frey she would not sign it. He asked her what she wanted changed. She said she wanted it perpetual. He told her accurately, and she knew he was being straight with her, that a perpetual conservation easement runs with the deed forever. Not for her life, forever. Every owner after her and every owner after that one, into a century she was never going to see. She could never sell those 22 acres for anything but what the easement allowed. Neither could her daughter. Neither could anybody ever. He told her most landowners would not even discuss it. And Nadine Renfro said this, and Warren Frey wrote it down in his field notebook that same night, which is the only reason we have it word for word. That's the point. Somebody is going to come along in 20 years and offer my daughter a whole lot of money for a hole in the ground. I'd like her to be able to say she can't. Let me tell you exactly what she did there. Some of you have it already, some of you don't, and it is worth spelling all the way out. Ashmore Aggregates never wanted an 83-acre soybean farm. They never wanted to run one widow off one place, and nobody there ever sat down and decided to. What they wanted was a corridor. The Kelso place, the Duckworth place, the Lambert 80 on the West Ditch, and the Renfro Bottoms. 4 properties in a line sitting directly on top of a 230-yard wide ribbon of clean, coarse, well-sorted river sand at 6 feet. That was the whole thing. That was always the whole thing. The single most valuable aggregate deposit in the south end of Dunklin County was that buried channel. The flooding was not a side effect of the operation. The flooding was the acquisition strategy, executed with a slide gate 3 recorded option contracts at 30% under township value and a bank officer who held a real estate license and saw no conflict in any of it whatsoever. And they needed the middle of that corridor. The middle of that corridor was the lowest 22 acres of the Renfro place. On the 14th of September 1983, at a folding table in Poplar Bluff, Nadine Renfro laid a perpetual conservation easement across it, recorded in the deed records of Dunklin County, Missouri, and made it legally impossible for anybody ever to excavate one shovelful of it. The thing they used to try to break her is the thing she used to lock them out, permanently, on paper, forever. The 3 option contracts expired unexercised in 1984. Because a corridor with a hole in the middle of it is not a corridor. It's 2 pieces of ground. Ken Stanton filed page 14 with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources on the 22nd of June, 1983, with a 4-page cover memorandum documenting the discrepancy between the transmittal draft and the state-filed copy of the November 1981 geotechnical report. He resigned the same day. The state's enforcement action against Ashmore Aggregates ran 14 months and ended in a consent order, $118,000 in penalties, permanent revocation of the Western Pit Permit, and mandatory restoration of the impoundment area. The company's Missouri operations were sold in 1986. The lawsuit against Thurman Vandiver was dismissed with prejudice On the 9th of August, 1983, on the plaintiff's own motion, 7 weeks after it was filed. That was the second Tuesday in August, the same day the sale would have been. Thurman was never asked for $1 of that $41,000, and he never got $1 of his $5,000 back. Lowell Prentice resigned from Farmers Trust of Kennett in November of 1983 following an internal review of his brokerage activity. He kept his real estate license. He never worked in banking again. Nadine Renfro never said one word about him in public. Not to the Democrat, not to the AP man who called twice, not in the 20 years afterward. People who knew her said that was the hardest thing she did all year, and in the middle of September, she found out about the 11 acres. She was standing at the counter in the recorder's office pulling a certified copy of her own easement filing when she saw the transfer in the index. Dated May 30th, Vandiver to a buyer in Campbell, $6,200. The north 11 acres along the county road, the high ground, the dry ground. The only piece of that farm you could ever build a house on, the piece his daddy always said so. She sat down in a wooden chair in that office and understood 4 months late exactly what an old man had done for her without ever once mentioning it in a spring when she had been too busy drowning to notice. She drove out there and stood in his kitchen and said his name and could not get anything else out. Thurman Vandiver poured her a cup of coffee and said, "It was 11 acres, Nadine. I'm 72 years old. What was I saving it for?" She bought it back in the spring of 1984 from the man in Campbell for $7,100 out of what was left of the September payment and the first year's blind leases, and deeded it back to Thurman with no note, no lien, and no discussion. He hollered at her about it for 2 days. Then he kept it. Let me tell you what happened to that farm. The first duck season on the restored wetland was the fall of 1984, and Nadine leased 4 blinds at $150 apiece to men out of Kennett and Paragould and Blytheville who had been hunting rented water their entire lives. By 1987, she was leasing 11 blinds and keeping a waiting list in a spiral notebook. The Hornersville School started bringing 4th graders out every April for the spring migration. Nadine walked them down the levee ridge and let each one of them hold a bluegill for about 4 seconds, and she did that every spring for 18 years and never once took $1 for it. The bird people started showing up in 1986. They came from St. Louis and Memphis, and one memorable weekend from Toronto, and they parked along that county road with spotting scopes on tripods, and they were to a person the politest human beings who ever set foot in Dunklin County. And here is the number, because the number is the whole argument. By 1987, 4 years in the 22 acres of worthless bottom that flooded first every single year and had never in 15 seasons made a crop worth cutting were producing more net income per acre than the 61 acres of good high ground she still farmed in wheat and beans. Not more gross, more net, no seed cost, no chemical, no fuel, no hail, no 15th of June. The men who had laughed in that courtroom in April of 1983 started bringing visitors out to look at it around 1988, and by 1991, you could not find a man in that county who would admit to having been in the room. That is not a criticism. That's just how a county works. Tanya Renfro was 14 years old in the spring of 1983. She farmed alongside of her mother through high school, and she did not go to college the fall. She graduated because they needed the labor and the wheat looked good, and that is what farm kids did. She worked 2 full seasons, 1987 and 1988, running a disc, running a grain cart, and in the fall, running the water control structure on 22 acres of state wetland. She enrolled at the University of Missouri in the fall of 1989 and graduated in 1993 with a degree in wildlife biology. Her mother fully expected her to take a job in Columbia or Jefferson City. She came home. She built that wetland program out from 22 acres to 140 across 4 neighboring farms over the following 15 years, working with the same department and eventually with the same Warren Frey. She kept the high ground in wheat and beans. She never moved off the place. The Renfro farm stayed exactly what Delmar had hoped it would be back in May of 1968. Not bigger, not fancier, just secure. Thurman Vandiver farmed into his 82nd year and quit in 1993 on account of his hip and not his hands. He had a farm sale in 1994 and sold everything he owned with an engine in it except one thing. The 1949 Farm All M. 38 horse on the drawbar, bought new by his father at a dealership in Caruthersville. Engine rebuilt twice by his own hands. Every bearing in it replaced at least once, oil changed every 100 hours for 54 consecutive years. He never made it into a museum piece. It pulled wagons and mowed roadside right up until his hip quit. After that, he still walked out to that barn the first Saturday of every month, turned the fuel valve, pulled the choke, started it, let it run 20 minutes, and shut it off. Because a man does not let an engine sit. People asked him for 40 years why he wouldn't buy something newer, and he always gave the same answer. And it is the only quotable thing that man ever said in his whole life. It still remembers how to work. He died at home on the 14th of November, 2002, at the age of 91. The funeral was at the Baptist Church in Hornersville, and the building was full, and a good number of the men in it were in their 60s and 70s, and could not have told you the first thing about what happened in 1983 except that Thurman Vandiver had stood on a field road all that spring and let a woman do her own work. On the morning after the funeral, Nadine Renfro drove over to his barn. She was 58 years old. She opened the doors and let the light in. The farmall was sitting where it had sat since the sale in '94 gray, with dust across the hood, the tires down to about 8 pounds. And she did exactly what she had watched an old man do 100 times. Turned the fuel valve on, pulled the choke, set the throttle a third open. It fired on the second revolution. She let it idle a good long while, standing beside it with one hand flat on the fender the way you do. Then she climbed up on the seat, put it in road gear, and drove it out of that barn and down the field road and across the property line onto her own place, past 22 acres of shallow water with 300 mallards working on it in the flat November light. She parked it at the overlook by the wetland. No speeches, no ceremony, nobody there to see it. Just the sound of an old engine greeting one more sunrise over ground that finally made sense. It is still sitting there. Tanya never restored it and never polished it and never put a coat of paint on it, and she gets asked about that maybe twice a summer by somebody who thinks it would look better cleaned up. She always says the same thing. Every scratch on it belongs to somebody. Every dent came off a specific afternoon. Every hour on that faded tatch was earned honest, and you do not sand that off. Nadine Renfro never got rich the way a newspaper measures it. She just stopped being afraid of losing the place. And if you have ever laid awake at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic in the dark, you know those two things are a lot closer to the same thing than most people think. People around that county still like to say the Renfros got rich because a flood changed their farm. That isn't it. They got rich because a flood finally made them understand the value of ground they had owned the entire time. 22 acres that everybody, the bank, the county, the gravel company, and 4 generations of farmers, including her own husband's father, had spent 80 years fighting, draining, filling, cursing, and calling worthless. The land had been trying to tell them what it was since 1948, since 1945, since before there was a county to write it down in. It was a piece of a river. And a man who died in a soybean field in October of 1981 at 41 years old with a warning. Nobody ever answered, folded up in a welding box under a tractor seat, had put the whole thing in 8 pencil words on a strip of feed sack paper, rubber banded around a mason jar of sand. Water don't forget where it used to live. He was right. And neither does land. And neither, it turns out, does a county. It just takes a while. And sometimes it takes one woman standing up in a room full of laughing men and saying the quietest true thing anybody said all year. If this story puts you in mind of somebody who stood their ground while everybody around them laughed and turned out to have been right the whole time, I'd like to hear about them down in the comments. Tell me their name. Tell me what they knew that nobody else did. I read every one of them, and there is always somebody scrolling by who needed to read it worse than I did. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who refused to sell 8 acres with an abandoned windmill standing on it, the ugliest thing in the county, his neighbors said so for 30 years until a survey crew finally found what was sitting under its foundation. I hope you'll stay with me for that one next.